Hey everyone. We're about to start this. We're just going to take some time for everybody to be able to join us. So we are presenting Designing Dreams Sex Ed, and we're going to introduce ourselves and give a little agenda.
Hi, so can everyone hear me? Okay, hoping so. Okay, so Libby, we're going to go ahead and get started now.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So my name is Amber, and I am a R&B Billy Fellow, along with my lovely panelist. I currently work at Emory University as an evaluation and continuous improvement in communications program coordinator for an alliance called Georgia CTSA. I also serve as a Southeast Young Leader for Planned Parenthood, and I'm currently a doula in training, and I'm really excited to be here with you all.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yemisi Miller-Toney. I go by Yemi. My pronouns are she, her. I am a domestic violence legal advocate with an Atlanta-based organization called Partnership Against Domestic Violence, also an abortion clinic worker, full spectrum doula, and of course, an Erin J. Woolley Fellow. And I'm really excited to be here with you all.
Hey everyone, I'm Jai. I'm a junior at UGA, but I don't claim my school. I'm also an intern with NARAL Georgia, and I'm also a Woolley Fellow, and I'm really excited to be here today.
And hi y'all, I'm Libby Mandarino. I use she or they pronouns, and I'm the Leadership Development Manager at the Feminist Women's Health Center, where I run the Erin J. Woolley Fellow program, and I was also an Erin J. Woolley Fellow in the first cohort. I'm a practical support volunteer at ARC Southeast, which is Georgia's only abortion fund, and I'm a Capricorn. So our agenda for this presentation is we're going to go over topics that should be covered in a healthy, comprehensive sex ed program. So we've divided it into 4 areas: consent, pleasure, health, and safety. Then we're going to have a group discussion about anything that we've missed, ideas on how to present this information, any comments or anything else, and try to brainstorm what comprehensive curriculum would look like. And then we're going to go over how to pitch a sex ed program. So we're based in Georgia, which has abstinence only rules, but there are some ways around that. And depending on where you are, we can go over that. And then we're just going to close. So yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start with consent. So we'll go over a couple topics under this main one, but first we'll talk about communication. So of course, giving consent means actively agreeing to be sexual with someone. And consent's a big topic when it comes to just sexual activity, and should definitely be taught at all ages. And so just giving a basic definition of consent is always a great way to start. And obviously reiterating that it means letting someone know that sex is actually wanted. Also with that, it's important to reiterate that sexual activity does not just mean intercourse, but of course also genital touching, oral sex, in addition to penetration. And so any of those activities without consent is considered rape or sexual assault. It's also important to reiterate to people that it's important to be honest with your partners about what you do and do not want. And of course that can be difficult at times, but in order to make sure that your own boundaries are being respected, that's a big piece of giving your consent. So communicating those personal boundaries and also respecting those of your partners. Consent is something that's given every time. So, I mean, I know that in some cases, someone might have given consent at one time, but not others. It's important to let people know that it's a present thing, an active thing, and should always be given every single time when you're engaging in any type of sexual activity. And that both people are agreeing. And so it can be easy to oversimplify consent. It's not always a yes or no answer. And so that's also something important to always bring up. It's a complicated topic, and it definitely relates to how we feel about ourselves, how we relate to other people, but also how we relate in our individual cultures. and what we should and should not do around sexual activity. So a great way to really harp on the communication piece of consent is to bring in any type of experiential learning activity. So, how do we ask for consent? Actually having people practice that and practice with that language so that they can get more comfortable. Also, you learn how negotiating and talking to people can be difficult. And so having that practice is important. Also, asking for our needs to be met can be tricky. So that's another thing that's great to communicate and practice in terms of consent, as well as just navigating power differences. So that's also a huge important piece of consent that we might not think about all the time. And so really practicing those dynamics can be super beneficial when it comes to being able to communicate this well. And so at the end of the slide, I just, gave some basic examples of, how you go about asking consent. So can I fill in the blank? Do you want me to do fill in the blank? Very straightforward, to the point, and just making sure you're really listening for that yes or no answer. Okay. You can go to the next slide. So also with consent, it's important to know how to navigate this when using any type of controlled substance. So it can be hard to determine whether someone is intoxicated in any way due to alcohol or any other drug use. Of course, when you are under the influence, it can be, or that person can have a hard time communicating clearly. It's a good opportunity for misunderstandings to come into a situation. So there are definitely laws around who can and cannot give consent. Legally, a person is unable to give consent if they are incapacitated in any way due to drugs and alcohol. So that's really important to keep in mind. Obviously, in social settings, it can be easy to, potentially be using alcohol. And so it's good to know when it's appropriate to potentially pursue someone when it comes to sexual activity, because there's a fine line there, and making sure that you fully do have their consent. So that's something definitely to reiterate. The age for sexual consent is also different in different areas. So it's really important to know that depending on where, you live and what those rules are locally. And again, it's just important to check in with people repeatedly. So whether that's the beginning of the night, the end of the night, all of it counts, and there should always be continuous consent given in these types of situations. You can go to the next slide. And so again, building on that stigma and peer pressure that can come with giving consent, a lot of times that we take into consideration the perceptions of our peers and what they're doing, and that can influence how we ultimately want to behave. And so that pressure to engage in sexual activity is very real, and it can start at a young age and really continue into adulthood. And so that's definitely something to recognize. If you've ever had a situation where you've been peer pressured to engage in sexual activity, or even assuming that you should be doing it because maybe you think everyone else is. So a good way to fight that is just to know the facts. So the average age of people who start having sex is about 17 years old. So in some cases, people may think it's younger than that, but that is actually the national average. And so it's always a good idea to just consider the reasons why you might be wanting to engage in sex. So whenever you feel that peer pressure, taking that step back and really thinking about if this is something you want to do, again, recognizing your boundaries and what you are comfortable engaging in, what you're not comfortable engaging in. Paying attention to your own feelings, values, and desires. So that's a great thing to reiterate to people. It's not about what other people want. It's always about what you want at the end of the day. And also just recognizing your own self-stigma that you might have towards yourself about either wanting to engage or not engaging. That stigma can go both ways. And so it's important to check in with yourself and not, harp on any negative feelings that you're giving yourself, for whatever way you want to go with that. It's your decision at the end of the day. And so another way to also really give examples of stigma and peer pressure is bringing in media and messaging. So asking people to come up with examples of ways they've seen sexual activity pursued, like in mass media and in the mainstream, because it's important to consider that, because media can reflect and reinforce the dominant narratives that we have around power, gender, sexuality, relationships, and everything else. And so sometimes that media itself can pressure people into thinking they need to engage in something before they're ready, or whatever it may be. So that's a great way to also kind of dive more into those topics. And then lastly, with consent, just wanted to end with saying that changing your mind and revoking consent is always an option. So no matter what, at the end of the day, you always have, you're always in control in your body and what happens to your body. It doesn't matter if you have history with someone or not. Again, consent is always in the present tense. It's always actively given, and it always should be. You're allowed to say no at any time, and verbally, non-verbally, all of those communication tools and social cues are important. And your partner should respect that, whoever you might be potentially engaging with. And so it's very important to teach people to say no, but it's equally important to teach people how to recognize and respect a no when it's given to them. So that's the last point I wanted to bring up, and just making sure that we can use our voices, but that we are also always respecting people's choices around their bodies. And then this last little link, which I guess I should put in the chat too, because you can't click it right now, but it's just a really good website that I like. And it teaches teaching consent at every age, because it's definitely something that should not be taught once. As we grow and get older and find ourselves in different situations, consent will always be relevant, and so it can always be taught. So yeah, if anybody has any questions. Okay, I guess we can go to the next one.
Okay, I am going to be discussing pleasure. And thank you, Amber, for your discussion about consent, because once consent is given on both sides or on all sides, what comes next is discovering pleasure and what can make sexual encounters pleasurable. So if we're thinking about designing our dream sex ed, we of course have to talk about pleasure, because that's why a lot of people, or most people, are going into sex, why they want to have sex, because it can be a pleasurable experience. But because of the society we live in, that is not typically discussed or navigated when young people are given their formal sex education. So goals for a pleasure-based sex ed curriculum, first and foremost, 1, to inclusively, ethically, and sustainably locate sources of pleasure and identify potential barriers to accessing them. So that can look like asking students, what makes sex pleasurable and why? And obviously that can have a range of different answers, and it can inform young people in their exploration of sex from there on out. So 2, to imagine a pleasure-based rather than a fear-based sexual education curriculum. We know that fear is a major theme in a lot of the sex ed that we see happening in schools right now. So engaging with students on that end can look like asking, what is in the power of a pleasure-based sex education? Why do we need pleasure-based sex education? What can we get out of focusing on our own pleasure? And 3, to discuss and to discover what the prioritization of pleasure looks like for different people, and to encourage self-advocacy. So how can I feel empowered in my own and others' pleasure? These are all questions that we can encourage young people, students of our sex education curriculum to ask themselves and ask their peers. Next slide. Okay, so common sources of pleasure. We're going to focus on a couple of common sources of pleasure, but of course this can be kind of a never-ending list. But common is sex toys and props. And this is, again, something that's not typically covered in mainstream sex education, but still something that we almost always come into contact with or have experience with as we go on our sex journeys. So discussing with students potential barriers to sex toy and prop use, age barriers, cost, location, discretion if they're not living alone. These can be barriers, and really meeting students where they're at to find out how those barriers can possibly be overcome, because at the end of the day, these are places where we can find immense pleasure in our sex lives. Also, sex toy hygiene considerations. This can also potentially be a barrier. Are you able to wash toys regularly? And do you have access to safer materials if you need them? Introducing sex toys with a partner or partners. A lot of times for young people especially, that can be an awkward conversation. And so as a sex education facilitator, it's important to kind of start those conversations, ask how can students initiate and ethically have those conversations. And again, reiterating consent, those are all a part of conversations of consent as well, those active conversations. Lubrication is also a big topic in terms of sex props and things that you might need to have different types of sex. So addressing embarrassment or stigma for needing lubrication, especially during penis and vagina intercourse. There can be sometimes a stigma around that. And so asking students if they experience that and maybe how to counteract those stigmas. Silicone versus water-based lubricant. What are the pros and cons of using them, and for what sex acts would you use them for? Pros and cons of using non-lubricant as lube. A lot of times lube is not easily accessible for young people especially, or not as financially accessible. So lotions and coconut oils are used, but sometimes they can be corrosive to condoms or not be accessible for those who might have issues with accessibility in terms of smell and things like that. And then sex toys and props can help with sexual accessibility for people with larger bodies and differently abled bodies. So this could look like discussing with students that using pillows or yoga blocks to make certain sexual positions more comfortable is perfectly normal and okay, and can be encouraged if people are experiencing those barriers. Next slide. Okay, another source of pleasure, as we all know, is pornography. And I think a lot of young people come into contact with pornography without really having a critical lens. And so as a part of a really radically inclusive sex education curriculum, pornography has to be discussed. So number one, how does pornography alter our perceptions of sex and our perception of our bodies? Again, critically consuming these images, understanding that pornography doesn't always reflect how sex actually looks, and having those conversations can really go a long way, because a lot of the students that you will probably be interacting with have already consumed this kind of media. Number two, what does ethical consumption of pornography look like? Of course, paying sex workers is important, but consuming free pornography is also a lot more accessible. So discussing with students how they might be able to ethically consume pornography in all ways. How do we give young people access to inclusive and diverse porn? A lot of inclusive and diverse porn is hard to find. And of course, we want to see our own selves reflected in all media that we consume. So discussing with young people what that looks like and how to access it. 4, being critical consumers of all media, including porn. Like I said, and like Amber mentioned during the consent part, we get a lot of messages from the media about sex, about how it's supposed to be had, about what sex looks like and who has sex. And so really having those conversations about who is represented and who is not. And 5, erotica as an accessible alternative to pornography. There are a lot of different types of porn, and not all of those are visual. Some are audio porn, and that might be more accessible to somebody. And reading erotica could also be a much more acceptable alternative. Next slide. And again, when we go into a pleasure-based versus fear-based sex education curriculum, we want to ask students, what are some ways that fear is embedded in the ways you have learned about sex and sexuality from the media and in school and in other places? So some really good questions to facilitate this conversation and kind of switch gears from that fear-based mindset to that pleasure-based mindset can be, what are your expectations for sex? Do you expect to orgasm from sex? Does your partner expect to orgasm from sex? What kind of orgasms are preferred? What are your hard limits or things that you will not do during sex? Also relating to that consent issue. What are things that must be done for you to have had a pleasurable experience? What positions, kinks, sex acts, etc. do you wish to explore? And would use of safe words or a safety plan be helpful? And we can go to the next slide. And lastly, pleasure self-advocacy. This is really important. And I think this kind of helps people practice their pleasure self-advocacy. It's something that we always have to practice. And self-advocacy is really learned, just like consent. We have to always be having conversations about it that shift as we, go throughout our sex lives. So if anyone would like to, we'll go and kind of do a practice, but some of examples of practicing pleasure-centered phrases to maximize your pleasure and your pleasure of your partners are, I like it when you fill in the blank, or I really need this throughout sex to have a good time, or I don't need to orgasm but to have a good time, but this really helps, or would you be open to trying blank next time we have sex? So I want to get some other ideas as well about some pleasure-centered phrases that would be helpful. So I don't know if anyone wants to drop them in the chat if you think about them. Or we can go to the link, it doesn't really matter. Thank you, Libby. And again, we're just asking if you can provide some examples of what some phrases or questions or speaking points would be that center your pleasure or advocate for your own pleasure, or ask questions about the pleasure of someone else that you might be interacting with. And these are good ways to kind of facilitate conversations about pleasure and self-advocacy. Yeah, what makes you feel comfortable and good during sex? Or I enjoyed when you did fill in the blank. Yeah, okay. Keep going. That's a really good one. I loved last time when you did XYZ. That's a really good debrief. I think debriefing after something that was pleasurable or not so pleasurable is definitely a way that you can advocate for your own pleasure and the pleasure of your partner. Awesome. Okay, and you can definitely keep adding. We'll probably circle back around to this during the discussion session, but I will let the next person take it away. Thank you.
Hey y'all, so I'm going to be covering the health aspect of this presentation, and health is definitely one of the more obvious topics that need to be covered in a sex education curriculum, but it is rarely covered in a complete way. This part of the presentation also isn't complete either. I'll be just doing a brief overview of certain topics that I believe should be covered in sex ed, but aren't, as well as some tools for how to cover such topics. Okay, so the first one is periods. So why should we cover it? First off, periods aren't really covered in sex ed. I mean, when I had my sex ed course in like 2014, it wasn't even covered at all. And 44% of teenagers who get periods don't know what's happening to them, like me. And so that's definitely a problem that needs to be addressed. And so adolescents would definitely benefit from, I guess, both a scientific and a social presentation of periods. So like the scientific part, the menstrual cycle isn't even taught until college biology. It's not taught in high school biology. It's not taught in sex ed. And I think this, I guess, scientific understanding would help normalize it a little bit. And so the menstrual cycle consists of menstruation itself, where the lining of the uterus is sloughed off if the individual does not get pregnant. The follicular phase is when the egg matures. Ovulation is when the egg is released, and that is when it's the best time to get pregnant. The luteal phase is when the uterus lining thickens in anticipation of fertilization, but then it circles back to menstruation when no fertilization occurs. And so this is only taught like in high-level university classes, and it really shouldn't be like that. And I guess like the social aspect of it is that menstrual equity could also be taught as part of menstruation, such as a tampon tax, which refers to the fact that tampons, pads, panty liners are not exempt from sales tax in the way that razors, diapers, and other necessities are. And also a discussion about the fact that pads and tampons aren't really available in prisons or schools or public bathrooms. So I guess just like a holistic study of periods. Next slide, please. So crisis pregnancy centers, we should teach this because CPCs make it a point to target vulnerable people. That includes young people, single people, low-income people. And so if we teach young people about CPCs and sex ed, it will help protect them from being persuaded against having an abortion, which is what CPCs do. If you don't know what a CPC is, it is a fake abortion clinic. It's religiously affiliated most of the time. They usually offer like free pregnancy tests, and sometimes like baby clothes and diapers to try to entice people into going there. But they only get these things in exchange for anti-abortion counseling. So that's like how it works to prevent abortions from happening. And so sex ed should teach CPCs with an emphasis on how to tell them apart from actual abortion clinics. Usually CPCs will have on their website like a disclaimer like or provide abortions. Also they might state their religious affiliation, and this is actually a tool that a UGA faculty member who is actually one of my mentors, she and her team made this. It's just it's a map of every single CPC in the United States, and it's a really great tool that if you wanted to teach about CPCs to young people, this would be an excellent way to do that. Next slide. So Georgia law actually requires HIV to be covered in sex ed, but the main sex ed curriculum used in Georgia it's called Choosing the Best, and Choosing the Best stresses abstinence as the cure to HIV, and also prevents instructors from answering specific questions about how to get tested and how to access condoms and contraceptives. So if we teach testing as a frequent measure and a public health issue, it will help reduce stigma by showing how common STIs really are. Additionally, specifically in the context of HIV, we can talk about PrEP and PEP. So PrEP is for pre-exposure, and so it's for an HIV negative person who is at a high risk for contracting HIV, and then PEP is post-exposure after the HIV negative person has already had such a high risk interaction. And so the CDC recommends patients with HIV to share information about PrEP and PEP with their partners, but honestly, it would just be best if everyone knows about them. Next slide. So the last thing that I want to talk about in the context of health is gender identity, and it's because fewer than 20% of LGBTQ students report that their sex ed positively represented LGBTQ related topics. I know personally it wasn't even touched in my sex ed, and so gender dysphoria does have a scientific definition, but it also should be taught beyond that. And so I guess like in the way that periods should be taught in both scientific and social ways, gender identity and other LGBTQ issues should be taught in the same way. So it should include case studies and stories of people who have experienced it to just reinforce how common it is. And also, I think talking about gender identity specifically can open up the conversation to the difference between sex and gender, because that can also get lost in the weeds sometimes. And I feel like many people don't really know the difference between them. So yeah, any questions, comments? You can feel free to drop it in the chat. Okay, great. We'll have a discussion at the end, but I hope that you guys got something from that discussion.
Hey, so I'm going to do the safety section. So aspects of safety have been touched upon by really everyone in this presentation, but we're going to go under some more specific concerns and ways to structure a curriculum. So first of all, we're going to talk about birth control. So it's important when discussing birth control to include all the options. It's also a great time to provide condoms, internal and external, to all the students. A great activity is to have students discuss and compare and contrast different options. It makes them more comfortable talking about sex and normalizes birth control. And it's also helpful to hear other people's experiences with different types of birth control to help people make an informed decision for themselves. A really great resource for this is the Reproductive Health Access Project. They have these huge handouts that cover literally every single type of birth control. They have a picture of it, they have pros and cons, and the effectiveness, and it really helps people make a decision that works best for them. This is also a great time to bring in a guest speaker. If you have connections to a local clinic or a local nurse or a healthcare provider who can come in and they can talk to the class about different types of birth control and also go through the mechanics of getting an appointment, because especially for young people, there's a lot of anxiety around getting a prescription for birth control if that's the option that they choose to go with. So going over patient confidentiality, how it could be billed to insurance, alternative routes is all really important information for young people. The next topic is environment. So this is kind of like a large thing in terms of like what feels safe to somebody, but also just like physically, we know that young people are like exploring sexually. So where can they have sex safely? So this can just bring up a broader conversation about like, can you talk to the parents, guardians, older people in your household about sex? Can you go to them with questions? Can you go to them with problems? Can you be supported by them? If not, is there another person in your life that you can go to for that? Also asking them, do they have a private area that they can go to in their home? Are they able to keep doors closed? If that's not possible, what about cars? What about a friend's house, a parent's house, another like older family member's house? What options do students have to feel safe and supported? And this brings us into another big issue, which is legality. So I'm going to be talking about laws specifically in Georgia, but a lot of these laws, like every state has their own version. So it's definitely something to look into for the group that you're presenting to. So for example, in Georgia, the age of consent is 16, but many states have these Romeo and Juliet provisions for established couples where one partner might end up being older than the other. So that's an important thing for young people to know about, like age differences and experimentation with sex. Also, especially during COVID, sending nudes is like very common with young people, but it can have legal consequences. So for example, it could be deemed distribution, creation, or possession of child pornography. So students need to be aware of the risks, but they also need to be empowered to like do healthy risk assessments and also be able to advocate for themselves. For example, if somebody is to like threaten to distribute photos that a student has taken of themselves, they can use these laws like, well, that's technically possession of child pornography to kind of get somebody to stop. Also, a couple of states have revenge porn laws, and a couple more states are talking about putting them on the books. And those are things that criminalize people like sharing somebody's photos. So that's an important thing for students to know about. And then the last topic that should be covered is public indecency laws. So for many students who may not have a home environment where they're able to experiment sexually, they might be going to a park, using a car, any sort of like public area. And there are potential like legal repercussions for that. And those legal repercussions kind of change based on where they are. So if they're in like a certain distance from a school, depending on your state or locality, it can be a much higher penalty. So it's a great time to just kind of like talk about risk management and risk assessment for students as they make these decisions. The last topic that we're going to cover is relationship dynamics. So especially as young people are beginning to date and have romantic relationships, they can get caught in cycles with bad relationships or bad dynamics. So it's important to give them the tools to, one, identify when relationship dynamics have become toxic, and two, like figure out how to be safe in there. So there's a lot of online resources and hotlines, especially during COVID. A lot of groups have created like online live chats. And so this is a great time to like highlight your local area's resources. So if there's a specific nonprofit or hotline in your area, it's a great time to like ask them to come in and speak to the students, because that just makes it much easier for if somebody has a problem, they know exactly where to go and they feel comfortable. It's also a great time to like start talking about safety planning. So is there a trusted person that could be a teacher, parent, coach, minister, whatever in their life that they can confide in for help? And this is also important to highlight that some of those people, depending on their relationship to the student, might be mandated reporters, which is something that young people don't always know or think about. And so if somebody is a mandated reporter, that might change the way that a student feels comfortable speaking to them. So it's important that students know that before they decide who to confide in. Also, you should go over the signs of an abusive relationship so that people are able to see those dynamics. So like controlling time away from partner, controlling somebody's access to friends, other resources, things like that are really important for students to be able to identify. And then having them make a safety plan. So they can make a safety plan on how to get out of this relationship or how to ask for help. And they can do that using the online resources and hotlines, or by confiding in the trusted people that you identified earlier. And this is also a great time to go over technology and technological safety. So making sure that people know about like clearing their history, like different encrypted messaging apps like Signal or Telegram, and other ways to use the internet without being surveilled is really important. Yeah, so we're just, if anybody has any questions, we can drop it in the chat. Otherwise, we're gonna go into our larger group discussion. I'm just gonna put up, so this is, if you go to this teeny URL site, it's gonna take you to a Jamboard, which is like the virtual way for us to write up on like butcher paper during a conference. So if you go to it, tinyurl.com/dreamsexed, you'll see that there is there's columns for each one of the topics that we discovered. So you can add what we missed, what you liked, what you want to go further on, different ideas that you have for your own curriculum that you would want to include there. And so on the right sidebar, there's a little button that will allow you to, yes, I'll put the link in the chat. But there's a little button which will allow you to create Post-it notes. So you can add your thoughts to those and share it with us, and we'll go through those. So since the URL is in the chat, I'm going to stop sharing and pull up the Jamboard and share that. So just give me 1 second to transition pages. Okay, so you should be in the Jamboard, and then if you click this button here, this little Post-it note, you can add a Post-it note, and then you can put it on the board. You can change the size, you can change the color, so you can add your notes. So think about like pleasure-centered self-advocacy, think about safety tips, think about health topics that should be covered, consent communications that can be covered, anything like that, and you can start adding them into here and we can discuss them. And this is also a great place to add anything where it's like, oh, you didn't talk about this, but I think that this would be a really good topic to be covered. And if you have any issues with the screen sharing, please share in the chat. Oh, and the other thing is all the Post-it notes will end up stacking at a certain point. So move your Post-it notes where it needs to go. Otherwise, there'll be a big pile of all of them. Yeah, I love this, teaching anatomy and physiology in an interesting and sex positive way, because I feel like so much of the way that we discuss any anatomy or physiology that you do learn in sex ed is very like, there's strong moral judgments attached, which does not make people feel good about their bodies.
I also feel like that's really important to do that in like a non-gendered way, right? Like I think that is a really great opportunity to point out that like not everybody who has a penis is a boy, not everyone with a vagina is a girl, and introducing those ideas, because there's probably somebody in the room who you know, is experiencing some type of gender dysphoria or questioning their gender, and that can be a really validating topic to go into.
Yes.
But that also relates to the other sticky note, the health resources for folks who are interested in hormone access or gender affirming care.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's also another great option. Like we talked about with birth control, you can invite like a representative of a clinic in, and it's another great way to like help students feel more comfortable. So like if there is like a great local clinic that is really good at, you know, providing hormones and gender affirming care, like that's a great time to bring them in. And that way students who may want to like receive that care already have a friendly face that they're identifying with that they're going to see at the clinic. So that's just another great option to bring in. Yeah, these Post-its are so good. I really like the non-heterosexual discussions of pleasure and experimentation. I know at least I had sex ed in Georgia, and that it wasn't even touched. So just knowing that there are non-heterosexual like people in the room who are going to be listening, and making sure that you provide affirming knowledge and affirming tips. And I really like the minimal mention of sex and pleasure make all the difference. So many times what is taught is sex for the purpose of reproducing or a religious action that you give to your partner as a gift. Yeah, that was definitely my experience as well. And I feel like just the idea that you could even speak about sex is like, well, this is a pleasurable thing that you would want to do for yourself, is really impactful for young people to hear that and kind of change, you know, the way that they're thinking.
I'm really glad someone brought up the open conversations about HSV, stigma, and care, HSV being herpes simplex virus. And just being an abortion clinic worker, I would just like to say so many people have herpes. It is very common. It is, the stigma is there, but it's not necessary because it's something that a lot of people are living with and having great sex lives with and getting on with their, you know, their lives in really amazing ways. So I really think that that's something that needs to be built into our conversations for sure.
Oh, I really like this one about role playing for how to demand accountability and advocate for yourself, your partners, and your friends. I think that so much of the way sex ed is traditionally taught is like it's a lecture based, like somebody just provides this information. A lot of it is coming from a very fear-based place, like but the idea of like practicing complex conversations, and being able to like work out with partners in the class, like, oh, well, how do I talk about this? Because a lot of these conversations are complex and they are something that we just haven't seen a social script for. So they do require a lot of practice. And I think that making it more interactive like that also really engages the students more.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on that and address some of these under the consent side about saying how, I'll just read it. I'd want to talk about how sexual assault is not always black and white. Sometimes experiences are confusing or make us feel uncomfortable, and we don't always know why. There's a range of experiences. And also down below, where it says sometimes experiences don't fit into norms around what is considered assault. And so those are really good points. I think it just goes to show how important just having communication and communication skills goes and on both ends. So being able to really talk about what makes you comfortable and also feeling comfortable to share that and not feeling stigmatized if maybe it doesn't look the same as what someone else wants. And then on the flip of that, being able to receive that information and not judge or make someone feel uncomfortable or put any stigma on them or even get angry, it just depends. So all feelings, I like this also saying how feelings are valid. I think it's getting cut off. There might be more to that sticky, but definitely reiterating that all feelings are valid in every situation, and they should always be honored. So I'm glad that someone brought up how, consent is difficult. Sexual activity is difficult and situations are all very specific. And we should definitely keep that in mind.
I also wanted to really touch on, and Amber, I'll let you put your mind to this as well, but incorporating the anti-racism into sex ed curriculum is a really dope idea that I haven't really thought about much, but I'm thinking about, covering how, sexual stereotypes and history of like sexual traumas and stereotypes, can impact the power dynamics during sex, impact the way that we see ourselves sexually. The over sexualization of Black girls should be taught in sex ed because it plays out, in my life as a Black woman all the time. And it's something I wish more non-Black people came into, their sex lives with a knowledge of. So.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And even the question that's kind of sitting on top of that, where it says, how should educators evaluate and subsequently incorporate the particular needs and experiences of students of color in sex ed? So that's like a fantastic question. And I might not even have the best answer for that, but I think it's something that we really, going back on Yami's point, we really need to consider that needs look different for, different groups of people, especially when different groups of people are represented in different lights in media and in our cultures, in our society, and how we think and feel about them. And so, I definitely feel like that should be a piece of sex ed that is incorporated more to give a more tailored and unique experience for those who want to know more about that and live that experience.
Going back to pleasure, I really, so that sticky that says pleasure is a spectrum and doesn't have to revolve around orgasms, I love, because there are so many reasons somebody might not orgasm during sex. They might not emotionally just be feeling it, or there might be some physical reason that they can't orgasm, or a health reason why they are experiencing that. And that doesn't mean that sex can't be pleasurable and that both people or all people involved can't have a good time. That just means that as Amber was saying, there needs to be constant communication back and forth, and self-advocacy in those situations is also really important.
I really like that somebody put a post-it about addressing abortion stigma, especially for people who have more than one abortion. I know, at least personally for me, my sex ed experience did not even discuss abortion. And it's just absolutely important reality of people's sex lives. So talking about abortion in a positive, warm way that helps people understand that it's an incredibly common pregnancy outcome and experience is really vital to making young people feel supported and know that they have a variety of options.
I appreciate the yellow sticky under the health column that says teaching anatomy and physiology in an interesting way, in a sex positive way. I think everyone kind of recognizes that there's a need for that in sex ed, and also health resources for transgender non-conforming folks who are interested in hormone access, gender affirming care. Yeah, I mean, when I talked about like gender identity or when I talked about it earlier, that's kind of like what I was getting at too. There definitely needs to be like more discussions on trans and other issues.
Yeah, I really like on safety, if something doesn't feel right for you, you can stop an interaction for any reason. I think that a lot of times that the consent that we learn about in traditional sex education is just kind of stops at like, well, no means no, but it doesn't go back to like empowering somebody to feel comfortable saying no. So letting people know that if they are uncomfortable, they can stop an encounter is very, very important, especially for young people who might not feel as confident or might not, there's just like a variety of pressures going on. So really like reinforcing that they can stop whenever they want is vital. Oh, I also like this discussing body positivity and fighting back against fat phobia and making sure sex ed is inclusive of people with mental and physical disabilities. Absolutely. I feel like so much, there's such a limited way in which we do sex ed, obviously. But like making sure that we talk about pleasure for all people in all bodies. Like I really appreciated the part of Yumi's presentation talking about like potentially different positions or different like tools and how can we make sure that everybody is able to experience pleasure and feel like they can experience pleasure is so vital.
Yeah, I also feel like that's a huge part of teaching sex toys and props, right? Because, different abilities might warrant different, uses of sex toys and props. And if the earlier people get that information, the better,
Well, we are approaching the end of the presentation, so I think we're going to go back to the main presentation. But thank you all so much for sharing all these thoughts. This is such a helpful, generative conversation to think about sex ed. So I'm just going to switch back to the presentation now, so just pardon me while I switch. Yeah, so the last thing that we wanted to talk about was like, now that we've come up with this like beautiful, inclusive, like wide-ranging sex ed curriculum, how do you share this information? So I think there's 3 helpful ways to think about this. So like who, where, and your pitch. So who is like, what groups do you have connections to? If you work at a nonprofit, are there young people or organizations that serve young people that you're in contact with? What ages do you feel comfortable speaking to? Because you can do sex ed at any age. So where is your like sweet spot of where you feel most comfortable with? Are you going to include parents in the conversation? Because sometimes it is really helpful to have these conversations with parents, guardians, and caretakers. And then also language resources. So like we have a program at our clinic where we primarily work with the Latinx community near our clinic. And so making sure that our sex ed curriculum is in Spanish was a really important step in making sure that we could adequately provide this care. And then where is a really big part. So a lot of times when we think of sex ed, we think about a class in school, but it doesn't actually have to be during the school day, especially if you live in a state, city, or region that has difficult rules around abstinence only or what can and can't be covered in sex ed. So you could get involved in an after school program. So like we've provided sex ed as an after school opt-in program before, which has been really helpful, especially in counties that are very strictly abstinence only. Also community groups, so churches, book clubs, any group of parents that you have access to, or any other group that you have access or connections to can like host a couple of these. And then when you're pitching this to a community organization, a school, or a group, think about, first of all, like bring in some allies. So if you know people there who can advocate for you and speak to you, that's great. Also, for us, it's been extremely helpful to like have the parents on board first. So like the after school program we do at a high school, it's been super helpful to the parents know the value of this curriculum and like speaking to the school, and they listen to it more. And so you can like, do an assessment, get the parents involved, and also like think of creative ways to share the materials. So for example, when we first started doing sex ed, we pitched it more as like a confidence building program. And we spent a lot of time working on like confidence and empowerment tools for young people. And then a part of that was also sex education, but it was more comfortable for the school administrators to think of it as confidence and empowerment for young people. So those are like some little like loophole ways to like be able to do sex ed, but the important thing is to just think about your community and where you can fit in and where you can provide this information. So thank you all so much for coming. It was really nice to co-create this curriculum with you and think about ways to expand and broaden our sex ed curriculums. And I hope that you all bring this into your own communities. Here are just some like last ways to stay in touch with us. So we're out of the Feminist Women's Health Center, which is an independent abortion clinic here in Atlanta. So you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and then we also have a website with a newsletter where you can keep up to date with anything that we're doing. If y'all have any final questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And also if any of our other presenters has a project or anything they want to plug. Otherwise, thank you all so much for everything today. It was really nice to discuss this with you all.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. This was very fun.